Most gardeners are still turning compost like it's a moral obligation, not a choice, and it's quietly costing them time, nutrients, and soil structure. Every time you flip a pile, you dump stored heat, break fungal networks, and oxidize organic matter that could have stayed in the system longer. The real-world result is compost that finishes fast but feeds soil poorly, and beds that need constant inputs just to hold fertility. I'll say this plainly: if you're still turning compost because you were told compost needs air, you're doing unnecessary work for mediocre results. Subscribe to the Farm Logic channel now, because this old-world compost bed approach solves that problem at the system level, not with tricks. This isn't a pile, it's a living bed that manages itself. The mistake is thinking compost is a temporary process you rush through and then haul somewhere else. Traditional compost piles are treated like projects. This system treats compost as infrastructure. Once built, it stays in place, feeds continuously, and never needs turning because airflow and biology are already handled. I've run this compost bed in in-ground gardens, inside raised beds, and adapted versions alongside hydroponic systems, where compost tea and leachate mattered more than bulk material. The principle holds across all of them. Structure first, materials second, patience third. So, why did turning compost become so popular in the first place? Well, turning compost really took off because people started building piles without any real structure. If you just make a loose heap of kitchen scraps and dry leaves, it's almost certain to go anaerobic, unless you step in and do something about it. In reality, turning was introduced as a fix for a flawed design, not because it's actually required for decomposition. Now, old-world systems, they approached this in a completely different way. They made their compost heaps wide, layered them with real intention, and always kept them in close contact with the soil and its organisms. When you've got proper airflow built right in, and the moisture is balanced, the biology takes care of the turning for you. Pretty clever, isn't it? This compost bed, it starts with air that never disappears. The foundation, honestly, matters more than anything you put on top. I always start directly on soil, never on concrete or plastic. The bottom layer is made up of coarse, woody material, but not wood chips. Think of thumb-thick sticks, prunings, and stiff stems, all laid loosely to a depth of about 6 inches. This layer doesn't break down quickly, and that's actually the point. It creates permanent air channels that earthworms and microbes will use for years to come. On top of that goes a thicker layer of mixed organic matter. I aim for roughly 2 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen by volume, but, I don't obsess over it. Carbon here means leaves that have already dulled in colour, old straw, or shredded cardboard that's been soaked thoroughly. Nitrogen means kitchen scraps, green weeds, manure if available, or even fresh trimmings. This layer is usually about 12 to 16 inches deep when built. Everything is built wide, not tall. Height is where most compost systems fail, honestly. Tall piles compact under their own weight and squeeze out air. This bed stays under 3 feet tall at all times, and usually closer to 2. Width is more important. A bed 4 to 5 feet wide holds heat and moisture without collapsing inward. Once the materials are in place, I cap the bed with 2 to 3 inches of finished compost or garden soil. This isn't decoration. That cap inoculates the system with microbes, holds moisture, and eliminates odor. Within a week, the bed settles and starts warming gently, not explosively. So you might be wondering why this bed never really needs turning in practice. Well, air actually enters from below through the woody layer, and also from the sides because the bed isn't compacted at all. Moisture gets absorbed and redistributed throughout, instead of just pooling in one spot. Fungi you see move laterally through those carbon-rich layers, while bacteria are more active, closer to the nitrogen pockets. If you were to turn it, honestly, you'd just disrupt that balance. Out of curiosity, I've actually monitored the internal temperatures over time. What's interesting is that this bed doesn't spike like a typical hot compost pile. Instead, it sort of cruises in the warm range for several weeks, and then, it slowly cools while still breaking down. That slower process preserves more stable organic compounds. And honestly, that's exactly what your soil is going to benefit from. So, how does this work directly in a vegetable garden? Well, in one garden, I actually built this compost bed right where a row of heavy feeders would be planted the following season. I left it completely untouched through winter. By spring, the bed had sunk by almost half. It smelled sweet and was absolutely crawling with worms. I just planted straight into it without removing a thing. The crops in that row outperformed identical varieties grown in beds amended with turned compost. The difference wasn't explosive early growth, but rather it was consistency. Plants stayed green longer, resisted stress better, and didn't stall mid-season. Using this system inside raised beds, well, that's where this approach really shines. I build the same structure inside a bed frame, starting with a thinner woody layer, usually about 4 inches instead of 6. The active compost layer goes in deeper, often 18 inches, because raised beds can handle the volume. I treat the top of the bed as both compost and growing surface. Early in the season, shallow-rooted crops grow directly in the top soil cap. As the season progresses, deeper roots tap into the decomposing layer below. There's no clear boundary between compost and soil, which is exactly how plants prefer it. Managing moisture without turning or fussing is honestly easier than many people think. Moisture control is simple, but, absolutely critical. This bed should feel like a wrung-out sponge when you squeeze material from the middle, damp, but not dripping. If it dries out completely, decomposition slows right down. On the other hand, if it's waterlogged, air channels still prevent rot, but, progress slows there too. In dry climates, I mulch the top with old leaves or straw, just to reduce evaporation and keep things ticking along. In wet climates, I slightly reduce the nitrogen-heavy inputs and keep the bed a bit narrower, so excess water can drain sideways more easily. Let's correct the myth that compost must finish before use. One of the biggest misconceptions is that compost must be done before it touches plants. That idea comes from hot compost systems, which can burn roots if misused. This bed never reaches that stage. The top layer is always stable enough to grow in, while lower layers, they just continue breaking down. I've transplanted seedlings directly into these beds without issue, even while kitchen scraps were still visible deeper down. Roots know where to go. They don't dive into unstable zones unless conditions are right. Adapting the idea for hydroponic and hybrid systems. In hydroponic setups, I don't use the compost bed as a growing medium, but I still build a version nearby. Leachate from this bed, diluted heavily, makes a biologically rich input for systems that rely on mineral nutrients alone. I've also used shallow versions of this bed as biological filters in aquaponic adjacent setups. The same principle applies: no turning, steady biology, stable conditions. What you give up by not turning, and why it's worth it. You give up speed and visual satisfaction. You don't get a fast, uniform, crumbly product on a schedule. What you gain is a system that feeds soil continuously, preserves nutrients, and requires almost no labor once established. For serious gardeners, that trade is obvious. Time and stability matter more than ticking boxes. Why this approach keeps working year after year? After the first year, the bottom woody layer becomes a permanent sponge full of life. Each new season, You add material on top, cap it lightly, and let the system continue. It doesn't reset, it matures. That maturity shows up in soil structure, water retention, and crop resilience. You stop chasing fertility and start maintaining it. If this way of thinking about compost changed how you see your garden, subscribe to the Farm Logic channel and share this video with someone who's tired of doing extra work for average results. Better food comes from systems that respect how soil actually works, and practical knowledge like this only gets stronger the more it's used.